how often we should run quantitative risk assessment on a project. On projects that I have been involved in, it's actually been done really early on in the project, before we baseline our plan. So is it really a normal practice, or we have to do quantitative risk assessment on more frequency throughout the project? What are your thoughts on that?
I guess I'll kind of answer this in two parts. Generally, the earlier you do a risk intervention, the better it's going to be for a project. And that doesn't necessarily mean running a QRA very early in feasibility. What I'm really talking about here is just identifying the risks and maybe qualitatively scoring them. So you can start to think about mitigations. Once you have an estimate and schedule that's in sufficient detail, it may then be appropriate to run a QRA. Typically in the US, probably around 20% design. The frequency of QRAs, I guess, ultimately depends on the size of your project. For smaller projects, I'd probably say, let's say less than $50 million. Once a year or once in each phase may be enough. By phases, I mean you may hold QRA in concept design, final design, pre-award, and then maybe an NTP kind of starter construction. And what you're really looking for there is kind of certainty in your project cost and project finish date. And each of those steps, usually if you have a gated process, there'll be some kind of gate where you have to go through. And a QRA to kind of support that is very useful, because a QRA kind of reviews schedule, estimates, scope, stakeholders, all the assumptions in its very nature. So it can be a very useful meeting. For larger projects, this may be much more frequent, and this ultimately depends on what you're using the outputs for. Typically on a large program, you're looking for trends, kind of what's my final cost, what's my final finish date, and are things getting better or worse? So once a year is probably too infrequent. Generally, I'd say once a quarter is enough, but I've worked on programs that hold QRAs every month and kind of track the trends. So it kind of, for the very large project, it kind of depends on what you're using the data for, and how often you get a schedule revision or an estimate revision.
Wow, interesting. Thank you for sharing your insight on that, because I thought it's best to use early on in the project, but you have such a valid point throughout the project, and the benefits that you can gain by running that. I didn't expect to hear once a month in one of your projects, but that's exciting.
Well, yeah, it's usually, if QRAs are held every month, it normally means the project is either very risky or it's already late or got budget issues. Because yes, I guess you get a bit more attention on risk then.
Exactly.
But just once a project's kind of been awarded and kind of, I guess typically big programs tend to be design build, but once you're kind of in design and construction, you still need to track risk, because you need to know when your project's going to finish and how much it's going to cost. And the best way to do that is through risk assessments. So in some ways, the frequency of risk assessments increase once construction starts, because that's when you're spending the most money.
Well said. Thank you.